Hi everybody, welcome to another conversation with me, Clare Farrell, and
I'm Dr Charlie Gardner.
We're presenting a series of conversations called News from a World in Flux, and we're aiming with that to highlight things that aren't getting enough attention, particularly in the media, reflect on some of the things that are happening in the climate space, and particularly use Charlie's expertise in science to look at the details of what's happening. And today we're going to talk about trees and how trees have been used as a theme for climate mitigation and as a climate solution, and some new research about that, and also just reflect a little bit on the recent actions that Extinction Rebellion has done in the UK around the insurance sector. So Charlie, do you want to explain, there's a new paper that's just come out that's talking about trees, and that's your area.
Right, so trees have been, and well, ecosystems in general have been promoted as a climate solution for a long time. You know, as we all know, they store lots of carbon, not just in trees, but in the soil, in animals, and they can sequester carbon from the atmosphere too. So there was lots of excitement a few years ago when there was research came out showing just how much potential nature has to contribute to mitigating climate change. So there's this whole suite of what we call natural climate solutions, which is like, you know, conserving forests, restoring more forests, and things like that. And the research came out saying that these natural climate solutions could contribute about a third of the emissions cuts that we need to meet our climate targets, which is great. But there's been some more recent research, including this paper came out a couple of weeks ago, highlighting some of the issues with this and just making it really, really clear that there's perhaps been just a bit of an overblown focus on natural climate solutions at the expense of what we really need to do, which is, of course, address the fossil fuel industry and shut down the fossil fuel industry. So this paper was about albedo effects. So that's about reflectivity. If you have a grassland that's really light in colour, and light colours reflect light, so it just, when the solar energy hits the ground, it just bounces straight back. But if you replace that grassland with trees, foliage is dark. And that means those trees absorb that energy rather than reflecting it back. So whilst they are absorbing carbon, they're also absorbing heat directly. And this research suggests that actually the estimates of how much of an impact increasing tree cover could have has actually been overblown by as much as 30%. And the thing is, this isn't even the only issue with increasing tree cover as a climate solution. So in China, for example, they've been increasing tree cover for a long time. They've been working really hard at this, and they've done really well. But in places where they have established trees, they found that the trees have dried out the soil because they're sucking out all the water, and that, you know, drying out the soil is having other negative impacts. So it's not turning out to be quite the solution that we'd hoped it would be either. But the really big scary thing, when we hear these estimates of how much of a solution tree cover could be, is that those calculations were actually based on some quite dodgy maths. Because basically what they did was they took the whole area of the world and they took out everything that isn't cities or farms or forests, and they said, right, well then everything else could be trees, can't it? And they said, that basically the calculations were like literally how many trees could we fit on planet Earth, and then if we completely filled everything with trees, then that would contribute 30% of the problem. But the thing is, this is devastating for wildlife, because trees aren't the only ecosystem in the world, and there are lots of places that aren't supposed to be forests. They're supposed to be grasslands, or they're supposed to be heaths or fens or other kinds of open ecosystem, right? And if you take a rich natural grassland and you plant trees on it, you haven't created a forest, you've destroyed a grassland. And that's bad in all sorts of ways. Like, there might be lots of carbon stored in the soil in that grassland, but then when you plant a tree, that carbon's released. So it might not even be good for carbon. But it's also devastating for wildlife. What about all the grassland species that have their habitats destroyed? And when you look at these maps of like global priority areas for tree planting, when you look at them more closely, loads of the places that have been highlighted as priority places for tree planting just should never go on the trees. Like, we've all seen these amazing Attenborough videos of like the Masai Mara and the Serengeti and these grasslands in East Africa, right? It's beyond nonsensical to think that planting those places with eucalyptus plantations is being proposed as a climate solution. But it is.
When we did This Is Not a Drill, we were insistent that they had to use recycled paper, and I went into looking at, how people are producing carbon zero paper from virgin forests in Scandinavia, for example, and that's always rapid growth, like eucalyptus or pine, that basically biodiversity dead zone, rapid growth trees. Also like eucalyptus trees acidify the soil, so then there's you really can't foster a good environment for other species.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just seems really remarkable to me that as soon as you start to look into the things around tree planting, there's like lots and lots of issues, aren't there, with where you do it, what types
there really
you choose.
Yeah. And one of the big problems is, as you say, a group of trees isn't a forest. And a plantation of trees is a completely different thing to a biodiverse ecosystem. Like, I'm sure many people watching will have been in a plantation forest. If you go into Scotland, there's all these pine plantations, or maybe you've been into eucalyptus plantations somewhere else. But you go into them and they're like deserts. They're devoid of life. There's no insects buzzing, there's no birds singing, because there's no life in there. The pine plantations we have in the UK, they are dark. You go in there, they're dark because they're so densely planted that the light can't even reach the ground. So there's nothing else growing there. And I mean, when we think about the difference between a natural forest and the plantation of trees, I think we really need to think about what it is we want when we're talking about increasing tree cover. When your objective is simply planting trees or absorbing carbon, it's very easy to sort of like make the case that all you need to do is just stick some trees in the ground and that's it, job done. But actually a forest is so much more than a collection of trees. It's so much more than just sticks of carbon in the ground. Forests are full of life. They sustain hundreds, thousands of other species of plants and insects and animals. They are really good for the soil. They are really good for preventing floods because they help regulate. They help water absorb into the ground instead of running straight off. They're wonderful places that people love, that contribute to people's well-being, and they make our country a better place when we have natural forests. And the plantation of trees just doesn't do any of those things. Apart from the fact that a plantation of trees in the wrong place is very, very bad, negative and destructive, even a plantation of trees in the right place is nowhere near as good as a naturally regenerated forest. And this is a real problem. So because when we talk, even if we're just talking about trying to absorb carbon, there's quite good data showing that actually planting trees isn't the best thing to do at all. Letting the ground regenerate naturally is the best thing to do. Of course, it depends on where you're trying to create a forest. If you're at the edge of an existing forest, then you don't need to plant trees because seeds will come from the forest next to it, and natural regeneration is much more effective. A naturally regenerated forest will store lots more carbon than a planted forest. Of course, if you're just in farmland that's been farmed for hundreds of years and there's no sources of trees anywhere near, of course you'll have to do some planting. But allowing nature to take its course is really the important thing. And the other thing about planting trees is that, like, it's really easy to think sort of, yeah, job done. I've planted my trees. I've got my photo opportunity. I'm in the local paper. It looks like I've done something, and job done. But of course, if you're planting trees with the aim of sequestering carbon, then that only works if your tree's still alive in 50 years or 100 years, right?
Yeah.
And that means they need care. They need aftercare. And this just isn't what we're seeing. Like, there's been so many scandals from local councils. Yeah, my own borough council in West Norfolk have done this, which I highlighted. But so many corporations and councils and others have invested massive amounts of money, or small amounts of money to be honest, in planting a bunch of trees, and then they just leave it. And they plant them at the wrong time of year, they do it, and then there's a drought or whatever, and all the trees die, and it's just a waste of money. It's people wanting to do something, to be seen to be doing something, but not actually caring about the outcome of their action. It's just like, tick a box, we've done this. And this seems to be the ethos, like, around all sectors of society. It's like, we have a really, really incredibly difficult challenge. We need to decarbonize everything, and it's difficult and it's scary. And so everyone just seems to be like, right, well, I can't face this challenge, but instead I'm going to plant some trees, because that's the answer, right? And this ultimately, for me, is the big danger of focusing on trees and natural climate solutions. And there are so many wonderful reasons to increase the amount of forest we have. As we talked about, they make people happy, they're good for wildlife, they're good for flooding, they're good for all of these things. But if what we're trying to do is slow climate change, yes, trees will be a small part of that, but the big part of it is ending the fossil fuel era. And it just feels so often that the focus on trees is basically a distraction from what needs to be done.
Well, and they get a free pass, don't they, because they're nice.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a thing that you can do. It puts a negative sign on your calculation sheet, so people like that, because they can minus something from the build-up of emissions. People in policy world love that. People in negotiations like that, because they want to see a feasible scenario projection.
Yep.
And like you said, often I'm sure that the trees don't survive. One of my co-defendants from the trial was talking in the court about having come back to the UK from living abroad and getting a job with an NGO that was planting trees as offsets or whatever, and just going around and finding, I can't remember the number, it was something like 90% of them were dead because they just put the wrong thing in the wrong place, didn't look after it, exactly what you said. And I thought the people in the room looked quite shocked. The judge looked shocked when she spoke about it, because it is totally disturbing. But I guess this is also then takes you into that conversation about the problems of offsetting, right? Absolutely,
absolutely. So we need natural climate solutions. We need to restore nature to help us suck out some of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere, because there's already too much, right? And we need to reduce our emissions to zero. What offsets does is it allows people to pay for tree planting or whatever in order to carry on polluting. So basically, I've planted a tree, therefore I don't have to stop, which is wrong conceptually, but also, it turns it into an either or thing. Either we stop emissions, or we invest in natural climate solutions. But the reality is we need both. We need to reduce our emissions to zero, and then we need to use nature to reduce the atmospheric concentrations in the sky, because they're already too high. Like, even if we reduced our emissions to zero tomorrow, concentrations are at 420, and that's parts per million in the atmosphere, and that's too high. So offsets are just it's just a crazy idea, really. Yes, we need to be investing in nature, but we can't use that as an excuse to carry on polluting. Just one final thing that I wanted to say about tree planting is that there's this idea, like, yeah, but plant a tree, a 2-year-old sapling is not the same as a 300-year-old oak tree. And there is nothing you can do to make a 2-year-old sapling the same as a 300-year-old oak tree, apart from wait 300 years. So, and it's not like you could say, you know, all right, I'll plant 1,000 trees to replace that 300-year-old sapling, because there's an amazing landscape historian called Oliver Rackham, who knows all about the history of landscapes in the UK, and I always come back to this amazing quote from him. He says, like, even 100 5-year-old oaks are of no use to an insect that only lives on a 1,000-year-old oak. You know, you cannot replace a 1,000-year-old oak. And yet, here, the world's focus is on planting more trees, but behind our backs, we're just allowing deforestation to continue.
Yeah.
And like, it's just, you know, you cannot replace a forest. They are irreplaceable. So the idea that we're focusing on trying to create new forests, which cannot be done, essentially, when you're allowing existing forests to be cut down, it just boggles my mind. Like, yes, nature is important, but conserving the nature we already have is a million times more important. That's not a scientific estimation, but it's a million times more important than just planting new trees. You know, we need to conserve the forests we have. End of.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for me, the whole felt like a scandal, actually, the scandal of Drax and using primary forest to burn in a factory in the UK, and we pay for it with our tax, basically, to subsidise taking that material from Canada. I mean, it just makes you think, is there any hope of any rational behaviour at all in this situation? It blows my mind.
So for those that don't know, Drax is the UK's largest power station, and it used to burn coal, but it was converted to burning biomass, because the idea is that biomass is sustainable. Like, okay, you're burning wood, but by planting new trees, they will absorb the carbon you emitted from that wood, so it's supposed to be a zero carbon thing. There's some massive problems with that. One is that actually burning biomass is much dirtier than we thought. The second is that, yes, all right, maybe the carbon will be recaptured when you plant another tree, but it's not going to be recaptured for another 50 years until that tree matures. We need decarbonisation now. So emitting now to recapture in the future, that doesn't work because the future's too late. But the main thing is, as you say, is these trees, the wood that's being burnt in the pellets in Drax, it's not even coming from pine or eucalyptus plantations, it's coming from old growth forests. It's in Canada, in Estonia, also in Georgia, in the southeast of the USA. So, and it just, as a wildlife conservationist, it just makes me so distraught that, like, we've had all these sources of deforestation all this time, and now we've got this new source of deforestation, and it's supposedly sustainable energy. It's just incredible. There is no way on earth we should be destroying biodiverse forests as a climate solution. It's just absolutely not. And yet, Drax isn't just sort of allowed to continue. It's subsidised because it's apparently green energy. Drax markets itself as Britain's biggest source of green energy, and it's in fact the most destructive thing of all. It's really quite sick.
Feels to me like that whole picture around biomass and calling it like a net zero balanced kind of, systemic approach, it feels to me like it's the sort of it's a perfect example of how the whole conversation around climate solutions is often people just bullshitting themselves, right? Because I think for a long time there are many prominent people in the climate movement that were pro biomass, that went, this is, at least it's a system, you can replace the trees, blah blah, it's going to balance. And often I feel like the sort of belief in things that are not feasible or not real solutions, or actually don't take that much examination to see that they're rubbish. People across the board have got a tendency, I think partly out of desperation, to sort of see things that might help a bit and go, well, that's feasible and we can see how it works and we actually could do it, and let's like push in that direction, only to later go, oh shit. Yeah. And the same, I guess, with the findings on albedo in trees. It's going to be very difficult, I think, to have a conversation with the general public about, who don't know what albedo means, don't know how the Earth system gets, regulated through reflective surfaces and stuff, to have this sort of long-standing narrative about nature, tree planting, conservation, and all of that being sort of scrambled up, so that when, I don't know, me or you or someone from the climate space comes out and goes, actually, don't plant trees, or at least not like that. Yeah. It's kind of, you can see there's a real potential here, isn't there, for like deep confusion, I guess. And I get really worried about the state of the discourse in politics and in the media, where I really think most people are basically pretty scientifically illiterate, basically. Yeah. So the nuance of these conversations is extremely hard to hold.
Yes, I do agree with you, but I think fundamentally it needn't necessarily be as nuanced as that if we have clarity of message and clarity of demands. I mean, in very broad terms, what's needed is to end fossil fuels, and all these other solutions that are being talked about are being so hyped up because they offer the conceptual possibility that there's something else you could do other than what needs to be done, which is stop fossil fuels. So I think, and it's not like all those other things are necessarily unimportant, it's just they're not the main focus. Forests are important, forests are hugely important for all sorts of reasons, but when it comes to mitigating climate change, the thing that's most important is ending fossil fuels. So I think one way to perhaps reduce that risk of confusion is by just being very, very clear all the time that what we need to focus on is fossil fuels. So when people talk about planting trees, say, yeah, great, but what are you doing to decarbonise?
Yeah.
And just keep on ramming home that main point, was that all these other things are great, but if you're not additionally decarbonising, it's ultimately worthless, really.
Yeah. Well, and that takes us quite neatly into the next topic of conversation, I guess, because speaking of trying to end the fossil fuel industry or era or whatever, we've got these recent Extinction Rebellion UK actions, which were quite successful, it sounds like, from the reflections and the outputs. So there's been a week of action, 100 plus actions, 31 countries, XR UK was part of that.
So this is part of the Insure Our Future coalition, which is groups all around the world. So XR UK was working with other groups in the UK as under this broader Insure Our Future week of action. As you said, there was 30 countries or more had actions. In the UK, I wasn't part of it, unfortunately, but Extinction Rebellion blockaded the building of Lloyd's, the big insurers, with a human chain. There were also groups that occupied the lobbies of 5 insurers. And I mean, it was only at the end of February. It was a week before we filmed this, but it does sound like there have been some really positive outcomes from that.
There were also hundreds of thousands of digital actions, so people phone calling, emailing. We've found afterwards that the CEO of Zurich has said that he's willing to meet Extinction Rebellion and Insure Our Future to talk about the issues that they're raising through the actions. I suppose from a movement perspective, there's two things that I think are really interesting about this. The first one is that, as you were saying, to really get to the fossil fuel industry and try to make it, particularly the expansion of it, untenable, targeting insurers to encourage them not to insure those projects is obviously an intelligent, strategic approach to try and prevent the new projects from going ahead. But I think what's also interesting from my perspective is that since the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, I've been trying, a lot of other people have been trying to get the agenda changed from being about statistical probability of this outcome or that outcome, that degrees or this degrees or whatever, into a lens of systemic risk, where your analysis would be completely different. And obviously, the way we normally talk about it is if you want to build a bridge, but your design means you've got 20% chance it will collapse with people driving along it, you don't get to build the bridge because 20% chance of total failure of the design is immense.
That's different.
And we were working many years ago with the sort of science space going, we reckon we might have a 50-50 chance of hitting this target or that target. And to anyone in the insurance sector, that would be an insane thing to do. So I guess I'm interested in the insurance sector in particular because it feels like it has a vulnerability that a lot of other financialised services don't have, which is that it has to encounter reality. It has to actually deal with things that will break down, the places that will flood, things that will burn down, all of that kind of stuff. And I guess, if people are getting in the room with these people, I would imagine a risk-orientated professional, which you would hope that they are in the insurance sector, you would be able to have quite a different conversation with them, I think, than if you walk into a fossil fuel CEO or the banking sector or, other financialised services. So that's really exciting, I guess, that, there's an opening up of a conversation and the door's been opened.
Just on that point, actually, I think it's quite a nice illustration of our strategy as a movement as well, because we're trying to bring down the fossil fuel industry. But the fossil fuel industry has made it extremely clear in so many ways that they have no intention of stopping. So, there's limited gains from trying to persuade someone to do something when they've made it clear that they won't. So instead, what we're doing is we're trying to sort of undermine the sort of pillars of support that the industry depends on. So the industry cannot function without insurance. It also, it also relies on a sort of social license to operate. It relies on not having a shocking reputation, and it tries to greenwash its reputation through sponsorship of cultural institutions and museums and things. So groups like Culture Unstained and others have been pressuring those institutions to not accept fossil fuel money so that they're not being greenwashed. There's other groups that work on creatives and advertising industry and the public relations industry to say don't work with these companies. So it's quite interesting to how the movement's evolved to say, right, well, if you guys aren't going to do what you need to do, then we'll work on other groups to make sure that you can't operate.
Yeah.
And we need to think strategically about power, and if the fossil fuel industry is too powerful and we can't touch it, then we can reduce its power by taking away the pillars of support that it depends on. And I find it quite uplifting to see how the movement strategy is constantly evolving and constantly looking for weak points in the system to focus on.
Yeah, and the other thing that's in that vein of work is Lawyers Are Responsible, obviously, where they've gone to put together a declaration of professionals, KCs even, barristers, lawyers, solicitors, all signing up to say that they would refuse to ever work on any of the contractual legal work that's obviously you can't build a coal mine without a bunch of contracts, and lawyers do that work. So that's, again, it's an interesting evolution of a sort of sophisticated movement, I think, in its way that the different parts are operating.
Yet another angle actually is with recruitment. So student groups are working very hard to make sure that universities don't welcome oil companies to their recruitment events, and making sure that the reputation of the oil companies are so prominent that nobody wants to work for them. And that's potentially fantastically powerful, and we are seeing impacts. So I've seen data showing that no young people wants to work for oil companies anymore, and if you can't get the good staff, that's going to be a real problem too. So so many different angles to bring down the oil industry, and lots of interesting things to work on, whatever your skills and interests are as an activist. There are different angles that you can put them to useful work.
Yeah, and so can you tell me about what happened with Probitas? Right,
so Probitas, it's an insurance company. I can't tell you much more than that actually. But as a result, so last week, Christian Climate Action they occupied the lobby of Probitas. A couple of days after that, another group, I can't remember who it was, spray painted some red paint on Probitas' building. Subsequently, Probitas have come out and they've said, we will not insure the East African crude oil pipeline, which is a big oil pipeline that's proposed to take oil from Uganda out across Tanzania to the coast of the Indian Ocean. And they won't insure the West Cumbria coal mine either. And this is really significant. So apparently 29 insurance companies have now said they won't insure ECOP, the crude oil pipeline.
Wow.
And 6 companies won't insure the West Cumbria coal mine. And ultimately, if these projects can't find insurance, then they won't go ahead. So I think Probitas coming out and saying that they wouldn't do it is a real it's a real positive move. And of course, because the more companies say we won't do it, the harder it becomes for any remaining company to say we will do it, because then you immediately are labeling yourself as the bad guys. Everyone else in my industry is better than us. So really powerful and really exciting news.
Well, and I think it's in terms of risk, if you're one of a shrinking number of companies that's willing to support something like that, then there must be an increasing awareness of the risk of the project, an increasing awareness of the risk of climate impacts, and I would imagine the awareness in the industry of the increasing risk of your company being on the hook for doing something which is later deemed unlawful, right? Because I feel like if enough people will say that's an uninsurable project, it doesn't just mean the project can't happen and you're going to chip away one bit of infrastructure at a time, one coal mine project at a time, one bit of oil drilling at a time. But actually, if there were a sort of broader understanding that part of this risk is systemic risk to the companies themselves, because it's obviously criminal to be expanding fossil fuel now. Well, then you don't want to be on the hook for that in the future.
No.
I mean, I don't
If you have no
know.
safety in numbers,
I don't know whether that's going to be a part of their thinking. I guess we'd better check in with the people who go to those meetings and find out what they talk about.
But you can imagine it must be. You're exposed. You don't have the safety in numbers if you're the only one doing it, and that's got to make you think twice.
Yeah,
absolutely. So another way, of course, that we can undermine fossil fuel industry is by taking away their sources of finance. And there's long been big divestment movements to make sure universities and other institutions aren't investing in fossil fuels, but banks do it too. And there's been a lot of direct action taken against banks. I know in our last episode we talked about your action that you were found not guilty for, but tell us about the action that was taken against JP Morgan.
Okay, yeah, so there's just been a trial of a group of women, just exactly the same action really as I did, but at a different bank on a different day and a different set of people. And they were tried in a London Crown Court with a judge called Silas Reed, who is becoming pretty infamous in the climate movement. And they were found guilty very quickly, very short jury deliberation. It was a trial that I wondered whether it should even have gone ahead, because there's the consent defence, which I succeeded with my fellow co-defendants. That legal argument, of course, if it can get you acquitted when you've broken a window, the establishment don't like that. So they're taking an appeal. The government have sent an appeal against that defence to look at how to sort of remove it from climate protesters or nullify it so it won't function for us again. And that is ongoing at the same time as the JP Morgan trial began. Now, when Article 10 and 11, which we talked about, I think, at length in that episode where we discussed my trial, the Article 10 and 11 defence, which allows you to explain why you needed to use your right to freedom of expression in that particular way, even if you've done some property damage. When that defence was hanging in the balance because of an appeal, our trial got put on hold, got postponed, and we waited, I think, more than a year to get it relisted, whilst they resolved to take that defence away. The appeal went against us, if you like. And then we went to trial without access to that defence. I was very surprised that this trial started, given that their core defence, because they were only allowed one defence, which was the belief in consent from the owner. If they'd known the circumstances, they would have consented to the damage. I would have thought the fact that that was hanging in the balance would have meant that they wouldn't start the trial, because they would want to wait for the clarity to come. But then the trial ran, and I think with some concerns by some people that they may have that decided during the trial. The expected outcome of that appeal was midway through their trial. So I think people were very nervous, and I don't know how this works legally, whether they could pull the rug from under you once they've started the trial, but I wouldn't put it past them in a broad sense. I definitely wouldn't put it past Mr. Reed, who has previously jailed one of these women on an Insulate Britain trial, I think, where they were told they can't talk about climate change in front of a jury, and they did, because they felt they had to, because they had to be able to tell the jury why they did what they did. And he put her inside with another co-defendant for a few weeks. And so I'm sure for that person in particular going back in front of the same judge who's jailed you once just for speaking the truth, you know, it must have been a really terrifying experience. And so we'll, you know, keep in touch with that situation. There'll be a sentencing date sometime, I think, in June. So it's also a really long wait for these women to find out what's going to happen to them. But Judge Silas Reed is, you know, at the centre of the fight for justice, I would say, around these issues. And I think, in particular, watching what the charity Plan B put out in their press releases about this case, you know, it is also, I would imagine there's definitely going to be some appeal against it, because he basically told the jury that if they used their conscience to come to their decision and not just what he deemed to be the relevant evidence, then they may be guilty of a criminal offence. So it also sounds like total intimidation of a jury by a judge.
Wow.
So it's, I mean, yeah, the details are pretty, it just feels like a really extreme situation.
I think we've mentioned Judge Reed in a few of our episodes, but this is, you know, becoming increasingly, you know, really, really scandalous, and perhaps we should dedicate a whole episode to this situation in the UK courts soon.
Yeah, let's do that.
Cool. So it wasn't part of the Insurance Week of Action, but I did see another action 2 days ago that I just wanted to talk about quickly before we end this episode, because I found it really uplifting. So this was a group called the Climate Choirs, and they were in the Houses of Commons in London, and they put on this performance, you know, 100 or so people singing about stopping Rosebank, yeah, the oil field. And it was extremely, I don't know, I saw videos of it, it was really moving, and it got into the paper, and I thought, you know, what a great way to do a protest, because you're not going to get arrested for singing. Well, maybe under this government.
Wouldn't bank on that, Charlie, these days.
In fact, the conductor was arrested and then immediately de-arrested. But the point is, it's, you know, it's a non-disruptive action, very difficult to disagree with. And what I found really exciting about it was that, so my dad and an aunt of mine both sing, right? And I sent them the video because I thought they might enjoy a nice bit of singing. But both of them wrote back and said, this is so uplifting, I'm going to find and join. Or in fact, both of them said, I have already contacted my local climate choir, because there's like 11 of them in different parts of the country. And it just made me really think how, you know, my dad and my aunt, both of them, they've been sitting there these last few years getting more and more worried about all the news, really, really wanting to do something, wanting to do more. But for whatever reason, because they don't picture themselves as activists or something, for whatever reason, not doing more. And then here they came across this action singing, and they were like, yes, this is the thing that I can do. This is how I can do more. And that was really, I don't know, just really inspiring to me and really uplifting. Like, and made me think, you know, we're hugely creative as a movement, and we're always thinking of creative ways to try and spread our message, and creative ways to break through this silence. But another benefit of creative ways of action is that it provides more ways for other people to join. And it just really made me think, you know, everybody's into something, everybody has things they enjoy doing, and if we can develop more kinds of actions that appeal to people as participants, then I think that's a great way of bringing more in. And I'm not saying do these things instead of roadblocks or anything, but in addition to. I think we need to be doing everything, and we really need to be finding ways to invite people to join us. And I just thought choirs is a lovely way to invite people to join us.
The Commoners Choir, I don't know if you've ever heard of those people. They're very gorgeous. They performed at an event that I was at recently in Manchester, and they've got a very beautiful song which they wrote for our movement, and I guess we'll link it in the text on the YouTube post of this video. But the words are, call the highway blockers, our house is on fire. Call the soup throwers, our house is on fire. And seeing them perform in Manchester, and also other singing groups that came and convened with them, I think it's not just sort of unifying or beautiful, easy to sort of imagine, drawing in different types of people, but I think that singing together is extremely good for you.
Absolutely, in so many ways, and yeah, it makes you feel part of something. I think singing is just a good activity that makes you feel good, but singing is part of a group. I think maybe it's something about the harmony. There's no more clear way to feel like you're part of something bigger, because you're precisely in sync with people you're singing with. No, I can see that being really powerful.
Well, maybe we'll re-up the ideas about bringing a collection of choirs together in the streets, because we talked about that some time ago for the big one. I don't think we quite managed to pull it off on the scale that we would like. So let's go and have a think about that. All right, thanks for joining us, and please keep on supporting XR and follow future chats that myself and Charlie are going to have, and we will be back with you soon.